just going to take some case studies to basically try and explain how those work so you can see them in practice. It's much easier in some ways if you see them in practice. It's drawn from, as I said, the last 2 decades of my work, really on Iran, looking at things both on a historical basis, the historical record, but also obviously on the ideas of the more contemporary history and politics and policy as it's worked out. And I don't want to say, and you'll see this when I go through it, that the fault does not lie entirely with one side or the other. What I'm really talking about here is method and the way in which certain people, how we sort of analyse and understand Iran today, and what impact and consequences that has on the way in which policy works. So it's as much a criticism as you'll see of the Washington Beltway or anywhere else as what's going on in Tehran. In some ways, what goes on in Tehran is in some ways better. I'll give you one example of where it's better in a minute. So for those of you, just for a bit of light entertainment to kick off today, I mean, I'm looking, as I said, at myths, political myths and history. Basically, that's a very broad title, really to look at the specific examples of the way in which the historical record is interpreted one way or the other to suit political interests. And this is basically a standard sort of poster that the Iranian papers put out. They do a lot of these things. They're great. If you ever go on the websites, you can download them at leisure. They're pretty good. There's some good ones even now, that are going on with US campuses and this sort of thing, showing they're always done in cartoons or memes or this sort of thing. And this I just sort of put out just to sort of emphasize this notion. One of the central problems, I think, really in the historical analysis in either way is the way in which the Iranians see the outside world, and I'm talking about the sort of the elites, by the way, I'm talking about the political elite and the revolutionary elite, how they see the outside world, how it affects the way in which they operate. It's a sort of a development of what Hussein Shahabi has argued very, I think, persuasively about paranoid history, and how, of course, that affects the way in which we react to it, because actually we don't respond to it really as well as we should. We tend to dismiss it, ignore it, but actually it has an impact and it has an effect. So here, very simply, I mean, for those of you who can see far enough, you've got the Germans, the Ukrainians, the Israelis, the Canadians, and the French. I love the fact that the French are there, being controlled by the Americans, who are then, of course, controlled by the British. So you have to remember that Iran is the only country where the British Empire is still fully in situ and still running the show. And it's very difficult often for those who are diehard members of the revolutionary establishment, but it goes further than that, by the way. The revolutionary establishment will politicise it away, but it's much broader than that. There's a view that actually the British have a much better handle on what they're on managing politics in a global sense. Now, this is just to basically take off from where I left off last week, but also to sort of add a few more themes and ideas to the discussion. First of all, as I wanted to say, and I said yesterday, what I'm really arguing for is applied history in some senses, or the proper application of history to the political record and what it can tell us about the way in which states develop, societies develop, the process, the mechanics of that movement. I'm not looking at a static template. And my criticism really of IR, as it's developed, particularly in some quite senior Ivy League schools, it has to be said, in the United States and other places, that it tends to give you a static picture of what's going on. It doesn't give you the sort of sense of change. And history, on the other hand, provides us with change. But when I'm emphasising here the essence of history, it's something that I didn't say last week, which I should have said, which is, again, this sort of distinction that I want to try and make, that, of course, in the classical, traditional understanding of Leopold von Ranke's statement of history as it was, actually, as Michael Bentley has shown, when you translate the German properly, it's really the essence, history in its essence. And, of course, the essence adds that element of the unquantifiable, if you can put it that way. We're not looking here at radical empiricism. We're not looking here at facts in a very bold, blunt, and rather simplistic way. We're looking to try and get a sense and essence of what was going on and why it happened. Okay? We work within a field which has a paucity of evidence. We're trying to construct a narrative. How do we construct those narratives? And how do we develop those? We'll see again that there are different ways of bringing in evidence. Some are better, some are worse. Historians are just as guilty, it has to be said, as others, of sometimes cocking it up. They're also have this tendency occasionally, I have to say, of adopting sort of all sorts of theorems and theories that they want to then apply the facts to and construct the narrative towards. But the key here is what I want to say is that what we're not dealing with a situation where we have all the facts in front of us, or all the evidence in front of us. We're having to develop a narrative. And the narrative, in a sense, this is the other thing. So last week I was talking really about teleological arguments. Okay, the way in which teleological arguments are shaping the way in which some of these narratives are constructed, particularly in IR and other places. So this idea, in a very simple sense, that the Islamic Revolution of 1979 is the pivot, is the moment of change. Everything that you read into Iranian history prior to that must lead to this, and the consequences flow from it. I think this is a mistake. Okay, I think this is a mistake. I think it's a flawed way of looking at the history of the country. And certainly, by the way, one of the most striking things, if you talk to Iranians in Iran, they're still a bit baffled at the way in which Iranians outside Iran have a somewhat, shall we say, romanticized view of what the Islamic Revolution was all about. Okay, so these are things that I think are in terms of teleological arguments. And the other thing I want you to think about is the semiological chain. I take that term from Barthes, Roland Barthes, who talks about the way in which we construct narratives through a series of, constructed, in a sense, assumptions, facts, whatever. The reason I use this, as you'll see as I go along, is that in some cases it's very difficult to deconstruct something that has been embedded and entrenched over many years, yes, based on a series of assumptions that have been taken in and assumed, and therefore deconstructing that can be quite difficult. Now, the argument that I will pursue, which I was sort of, in a sense, alluding to last week, but those of you who weren't here last week didn't miss anything because I didn't actually state it as clearly as I should have, but what will be coming out in the following weeks really is this: what I'm arguing really about is about the nature of the state in Iran in terms of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I'm not talking about the country per se, I'm not talking about the culture. So when we talk about the state and the dysfunctionality or the weakness or the depreciating, the decay of the state, which is what I'll be arguing about, I'm looking at the political system. Okay? It's not like, for instance, if I was talking about the state of Israel would be the country, that if the state of Israel vanishes, the state of Israel vanishes. If the Islamic Republic of Iran vanishes, Iran does not vanish. Okay, so I'm looking at the political order and the political system. And interestingly enough, of course, those in Iran, when we look at the state, and I'll be building my own conception of that state next week, when we look at the state, in Iran they make a very clear distinction between the order, the nizam, and the country, Iran. And they're very clear on it, and they've been for many, many years, that the nizam comes and goes. The order comes and goes. They have no problem in their mind's eye about the impermanence of the state. Okay? If you lived in Iran over the last 100 years, that wouldn't be a big surprise, to be honest, because it has had one of the most volatile political sort of experiences of any country really in the world. Nikki Keddie famously said that just as France was the most revolutionary country in the 19th century, Iran is in many ways the most revolutionary country in the 20th century. You can debate that, by the way. I mean, I'm not holding that hard and fast. It's a nice statement, but it's one that at least makes us think. So, political change in an Iranian context, of course, simply just to make this, but it's funny how people won't accept it, this notion that states rise and fall, that political systems rise and fall. Even if you just want to take it from a Khaldunian perspective, it's not difficult to accept. But it's funny how people see the degree of permanence in the current setup that historians simply wouldn't, because obviously our perspective is slightly longer. Yeah? But the fact is that a succession of states in Iran have risen and fallen. From the Safavids, to the Afsharids, to the Zand, to the Rajars, to the Pahlavis. People have to explain to me why the Islamic Republic of Iran is an exception to this rule. Okay? I mean, that's what I'm trying to say. If you look in the historical context, change is normal. And it's normal for various reasons, by the way. Okay? Because of the way in which the state operates and the way in which the state fails to actually establish the popular roots or the popular authority that it should do. Okay? The other thing that they do, of course, and what I want to sort of emphasize with this, as you'll see as a theme, is that the states fall by and large not because of the strength of the opposition. Very rarely there is no real opposition. The states often fall because of the incompetence, incoherence, corruption, and moral failure of the state hierarchy and the elites. It's the same with the Safavids. The Rajars you can debate, but it's interesting, the Rajars, because they lasted that long, in part not because they were a strong state, but because society wasn't organised really to agitate against them in quite that same way. But when the change came, it came very rapidly, and it came very rapidly because, in a sense, the monarch at the time basically caved in. Same with the Pahlavis in some ways. What fell in 1979? The Pahlavi state or the Pahlavi monarchy? I would argue that it was the monarchy that failed. The state was inherited, by the way. And this is something also that's very important. I find it tiresome and somewhat irritating to be told that in 1979 the Islamic Republic suddenly emerged out of nowhere, almost as if it was a new creation. Okay, that simply doesn't work. And it doesn't work even if you look at the officials of the Islamic Republic themselves. When the Iraqis invaded in 1980, the officials of the Islamic Republic were overjoyed by the fact that the Shah had spent so much on his military arsenal. They inherited a lot. They changed all the personnel, obviously, that's a separate thing, but the structures were there. But the key in terms of the decline of that, or the depreciation in a sense, is that it's a state that's inherited and then exploited and extracted. So what you're seeing is the politics of the extractive state. Now, there are two things here also that I want us to think about as you go through. One is also a level of fatalism and complacency which affects the sort of the Iranian elites. They all have it, partly because in Iran change, as they say, first of all happens very, very slowly and then very, very quickly. And it's because it happens very, very slowly that most people think nothing's going to happen. Okay, you get into this sort of like relaxed, rather loose, it's just not going to happen. Then suddenly it does. And everyone scabbles around going, what the hell did we miss? You didn't necessarily miss anything, by the way. It's just the way in which it operates and how it operates, because it's not anchored firmly. And sooner or later, what's going to happen is that drop of water is going to go over is going to be the drop of water that basically breaks the dam. Another thing you'll find with a lot of Iranians, and you'll see this quite clearly, but it happens in all autocratic or authoritarian systems of one sort or another, is a degree of anxiety and self-confidence, which is basically two sides of the same coin, by the way. I mean, when I used to go to Iran, a lot of people would sort of say, don't worry, it's all in hand. Everyone knows what they're doing. And I'd go, are you sure? Yeah. Oh, he knows. This, to my mind, is basically just actually a sort of a reflection of what I would call a religious mentality in some ways, where rather than, God works in mysterious ways, it's the Supreme Leader works in mysterious ways. He knows. But it's that sort of level of self-confidence, which, can be contagious. In my books, really, it's just the other side of the coin from deep anxiety about what's going on, because they didn't really know what's going on. And of course, if you go back to the conspiracy theories and the paranoid historiography, that's sort of rationalizing in your own mind something that you can't explain. So you have to find ways to explain it. Again, as I said last week, moral and political capital will come in. It's, what I'm trying to argue again is that we need to factor these into our understanding of the way in which the state operates. Again, as I said, why did the Shah fall? Shah didn't fall because he was poor. If your argument is that the state only collapses, or the state is resilient because they have lots of money to spend on patronage, the Shah did that pretty well. He fell for other reasons, okay? Including opposition, including other. But my point is you can't lay into one sort of argument and say, well, one of the reasons for authoritarian resilience is because they have wide patronage networks. Possible, but it's not the only explanation. Rationality always comes into these debates. Is the regime keen on survival? As I was saying earlier, what do we mean by survival? We have to interrogate these terms. What does he understand? And rationality in the pursuit of revolutionary goals is entirely possible. You can be very pragmatic in pursuit of very irrational or slightly balmy ideas, as far as we're concerned, by the way, okay? But in their eyes, that would be irrationality. So I don't want to get into this argument, as some people do, that we're rational and they're irrational. No, that's not the case. But there is a case to be said that some of their arguments are being driven by an ideological vision and determination which is leading them down a certain path. They feel they're doing the right thing. It's very rational. But actually what it's doing is leading them, sooner or later, the test will come in that sort of test of reality. And again, that normalization of tyranny is something that I also find interesting as part of the exercise in ideology. I've used tyranny as a slightly more exaggerated term, but my point about that really is that, there is this sort of issue when we're looking at Iran that, 20 years ago we were talking about democratic transition and people were arguing about it very heavily, including me, to be honest. We were arguing it very, very intensely. Now people are sort of saying, well, autocracy, it's the norm. Let's just live with it. As if, and in some ways, actually, I agree with that, but it's not the argument you were making 10 years ago. Okay, but now you've adapted to that reality and now you're justifying that. In a sense, your argument has been updated to echo a reality which you think now, you're not actually dealing in, you're just dealing with what you see. So those are the key, and the semiological chain is one that I want, and that also, in a very, practical term, is also reflected in echo chambers that we all live with, okay? Confirmation bias and echo chambers, and we'll see these vast networks of analysts who all talk to each other, all quote each other, and through the speed of social media, turn speculation into fact within the flash of whatever, in the moment. But it's amazing how things can develop and suddenly become repeated so often that it becomes fact. Nobody bothers to have a look at it. By the way, and historians do the same, I should say. I mean, I've experienced that when you go and check the sources, you often find that people have read things not exactly in the diligent way that they should have. So let me give you an example of one way in which the evidence is obviously read into in a way that is this is a very practical example that I use quite often. This is during the period of the lead up to the nuclear negotiations and the settlement of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015. I just want to use this as an example of the way in which people will how in a sense Orientalism works, if I can put it that way, because Orientalism works in two ways. Orientalism in a sense can be that sort of rather patronising attitude that the West might have to the East, but it can also be the way in which, in a very simple sense, someone seeking evidence for a particular argument they have tries to find it in whatever way they can without thinking through particularly what they're looking at. This, believe it or not, is a shoe advert that was put out in Tehran prior to the nuclear negotiations, and it was the first time that Obama was on a billboard in Tehran, way high, he's looking fantastic, against what they called this Persian warrior. And the shoe company, of course, said something like, I think the catchphrase or the token was step by step together, something like this. Together, step by step, something like that. We are together, step by step. Obviously wearing the same shoes. I unfortunately don't have the whole picture, but presumably Obama was wearing a fancy pair of Iranian shoes, and this warrior was there. And there was a tremendous amount of excitement by some analysts in the West, helped by the joys of social media and the ability to get things out quickly, because let's get it out quickly and lay down the mark. And they said, this is extraordinary, they said. For the first time, an American president has appeared on a billboard in Tehran. This is fantastic. We've clearly turned a corner. What they didn't actually realise is the figure on the right is a villain. He's not a heroic figure. It's a villain from Shia mythology. And basically placing Obama next to him was to suggest that actually, Obama is bad news. It wasn't anything to do with sort of suggesting that the US and Iran were about to make friends. And within 24 hours, 48 hours, of course, this whole excitement about the propensity for a US-Iran rapprochement suddenly, not that it died necessarily, but this looked rather silly, because what people were not realizing, they were reading into that what they wanted to see, and they didn't really understand the specifically Shia mythology that contextualized that. And if they'd known that, they would have realized that actually the people who spent the money to put this billboard up were being rude about Obama. They weren't being nice to Obama. So I want to look at 3 particular case studies for you in short order, just to show also how history works and how the study of that affects the way in which people think about the world, in a sense, but also internationally as well as Iran. This is mainly, I'm looking at really this sort of idea of the Great Famine of 1917. It's been pushed by a particular writer, an Iranian writer who lives in the United States, I believe, doesn't publish with university presses, but he does publish with the University Press of America, which, if you look carefully, is not actually a university press at all, but is a sort of like a private press. Nonetheless, his books have all the apparatus, all the scholarly apparatus that you would want, as long as you don't look too closely. Okay, so it's heavily footnoted. He draws a lot from basically American archives, and what he argues is, in a series of 3 books, but the first book was really about the Great Famine of 1917, was that the British committed genocide, the favourite word du jour, genocide in Iran in 1917, 1919, by basically fomenting and mismanaging a famine. Okay, and in this famine, the critical thing that one has to be a little bit careful of, quite apart from the argument there, the critical thing is he says that up to 40 to 50% of the population died. Okay, any historian worth his salt should suddenly sort of stand up and say, 40 to 50%, that's pretty severe. What on earth happened? Apparently the reason why there's no folk memory of this famine in Iranian sort of in Iranian sort of folk memory, poems, epics, a bit like the Irish potato famine or something, is because obviously what the Iranians done is it was so bad they suppressed it. Okay, fair point. I'm not sure, but it was so bad that they suppressed it. Things get a little bit more racy when Mohammad Ali Majd, I think his name, basically then actually produces a second and third book dealing with a famine in the 1870s, which did occur, by the way. There was a famine in the 1870s. This time caused by an El Nino effect, apparently. But a famine, and again, the important thing is it's never caused by government mismanagement in Iran. It's caused by some weird sort of structural exercise, and that El Nino effect was actually caused by British trade patterns, apparently, so the British are still there. Remember that first thing. So in 1870, there's a famine, and there was a famine, and again, this famine kills about 40 to 50% of the population. So think about that, please, okay? Just think about it realistically. So in 1870, 50% of the population died. In 1917, 50% of the population died. And then in 1942, during the Allied occupation, another famine occurs and another 50% of the population died. If this hadn't happened, if perfidious Albion hadn't got in the way like this, because it is perfidious Albion, nobody else is involved, Iran's population now would be enormous, we'd be flourishing and economically doing rather well. Now, quite apart from the fact that the mathematics of that don't work, and nobody's bothered to actually look at it, historians are also very weak on this, I've found. They like big numbers, okay? So whenever you see anything in a text that says 1 million people died, stop, think, check. Yeah? I mean, it is extraordinary. Very, very good historians will say that 3 million people died on such a... 3 million? So the first question you ask is, what was the population of Iran in 1900? The curious thing is, we don't know, because the first population census in Iran was in 1955. Okay, so you're making an assessment based on a speculative figure, and those figures are basically done by demographers who basically reverse engineer, in a sense, the figures, going back to see what the figures might be. If Iran had genuinely lost 50% of its population on 3 different occasions with 3 different generations, I think the country would have been decimated. Not the literal meaning of that, obviously, but really completely, more than decimated. But do you know what I mean? I mean, basically, completely, it would be a complete disaster. So I think there are questions to be asked for that, for a start. I mean, you should ask questions about that. But the key point is really the issue of British culpability, certainly in 1917, 1918. And here it gets quite interesting, and I want to sort of raise this, because one of the interesting things I found about this particular case study is actually historians working in Iran were far more sensible than historians working outside Iran. And this I found quite striking. So in 2017, there was a massive conference in Iran about perfidious Albion. Great stuff, had a marvellous poster of the Union Jack as a spider's web. Yeah. And everyone sort of attended this conference. Actually, was it 2017? I may be wrong, actually. I've got the papers. It might be a bit earlier, actually, but it was, anyway, and they all attended because, in fact, when did Rafsanjani die? Does anyone know when Rafsanjani died? Oh, so 2017, so he was there. I mean, he definitely came, Haddad Adel came in, and they all gave these papers. One of the fascinating things about the papers is, first of all, almost all of them were reliant on British documents to actually do all the work they were doing. So when they were looking at this period, and actually the Great Famine was not a major issue in that because they didn't deal with it too much, but when they were looking at this period, they were determined to show the vileness of British policy in Iran, and they were doing this using almost exclusively British archival sources. So there was an immediate contradiction there, that Britain was so perfidious, but they'd open their archives for you to go and have a look and see what the hell was going on. So they used a lot of archives for that. They couldn't find the things they were doing, they wanted, but the way in which they used the evidence was quite interesting. Anything that hinted at any malicious intent was highlighted and flagged up to prove the point. And this is the interesting thing, of course, is what they do when they go to the evidence, they don't put the evidence in context, they simply take a particular sentence or a particular line to prove the point, and that's enough. Okay, that's the way in which we would call paranoid history. This is actually a film that was made about the famine, and the basic premise of the famine here is that Britain, as the occupying power in Iran in 1918, following the fall of the Russian Empire, manipulated and hoarded grain, okay, effectively to create a famine in Iran. What this ignores, of course, is that the famine was already taking place before the British had arrived, and that the British contingent in Iran was extremely small and could not have caused the level of the sort of hoarding that people said they were doing. Now, to cut a long story short, what's quite interesting is that the article written by two young Iranian historians to try and contend with this, and they were obviously writing to order, if you will. I mean, they had to find something to show the main thrust of the argument. The thrust of the argument is the British are guilty. And there was a couple of things actually that struck me that was very striking about it. It just shows also the way in which you use evidence. So one of the things that comes out of it is that Dunster Force. So Dunsterville goes off to Iran in a sort of special mission, a bit like SOE or something. He's an Indian army man. He picks up a set of volunteers. I think they number 140. I mean, it's not large, okay, 140. And they traipse up across Mesopotamia into Hamadan, up to Hamadan, up to the Caspian. What they do in classic British sense, of course, is they take a lot of money with them. Okay, so the point is they have a lot of money. They're there to sort of basically pick up, extra troops on the way, hire various tribes, so on and so forth. But the main military contingent is small. And in fact, the largest element of that military contingent are mechanics. And by mechanics in 1917, 1918, I would read sort of engineers. Now, why is that? Because you need, obviously, the people to build the bridges, to make the roads safe, to be able to transport the various things you need to do up to the Caspian. The trouble is, in the sources, they're listed, believe it or not, as chauffeurs. Okay, which makes it sound a bit sort of slightly trivial. Okay, and of course the Iranian historians reading this go, so and this is they say, so the British invaded Iran with 100 chauffeurs. This is clearly not true. I mean, how absurd that the British Empire would launch an invasion of Iran with such a limited force, but then a limited force composed of drivers. I think that misses the point, of course, as I said, that if you understand the context of the time in 1917, these are mechanics, they're not just chauffeurs, they're there as well. But it's also the way in which things operated and the way in which that mission was organised. It was very small in terms of a footprint, but what it made up for was in the quality of the individuals going, all of whom were volunteers, and the money that Dunsterville was taking with him in order to basically smooth the way. By the time he gets up to the Caspian, of course, the force may increase to about 1,000 or 2,000 people because they're buying in support and whatever, and they're drawing in individuals and other people join them. But the fact is, the force that he's talking about is not enough to eat the country dry. Okay, I mean, it's just not possible. They're not hoarding it in that way. What these young historians basically conclude is they actually look at it and they make a number of very, very interesting points. One is that they say that actually there is a series of people culpable for the famine in Iran. And it was a famine, by the way. I mean, there was a famine in western Iran and it was devastating. What Majd tends to do is he tends to extrapolate from a particular province to the entire country. But Iran in 1917, 1918 was not, as we would understand today, a single market or a single political economy. It was a composition of very distinct local economies. And the western Iran was particularly badly hit. It was particularly badly hit because it was an area where Ottoman and Russian forces were fighting over. There's no doubt about it. It was mountainous. It had suffered a harvest failure, and it had suffered a very harsh winter. To add to that, government had basically collapsed. So there was no means of basically organising the transfer of food, this, that, and the other. What these historians basically argue at the end of it is the British were culpable in the sense of how they managed the famine, but they come somewhere around 5th or 6th in the list of culpability, that all these others take further culpability. And more importantly, they say, because we have no statistics on the population, we're not even going to get into a debate on how many people died, because it doesn't make any sense. Probably the most sensible thing any of these historians have said, by the way, and it comes from people in Iran. Okay, so I emphasize that simply to sort of say to you, don't have this notion, I don't want to have this sort of dichotomy of saying, everyone in the West does really great history and everyone in Iran does really crap history. It's not the case. Okay, even under some fairly tough circumstances where they're forced to cater to a particular ideology, otherwise their paper wouldn't get published, they still, in my view, published something that was probably better. Muhammad Ali Majd is Khamenei's favourite historian. Okay, he appears on his website. These two chaps aren't. okay? But it's a good example of the way in which evidence is used or not used, or how they're trying to tailor their sort of the details according to a particular ideology. So that's one example. Here we get a little bit more exciting into the politics, and that's the politics of the JCPOA. What you see here is Mohammad Javad Zarif, who was the foreign minister of Rouhani at the time doing the main negotiations with the United States, and he's being compared here to Mossadegh. For those of you who don't know your Iranian history, Mossadegh is obviously the prime minister that was overthrown in a coup engineered by the British and Americans, with some Iranian help, by the way, but certainly engineered by the British and the Americans in 1953. And the argument here is that what the nuclear agreement is doing is it is finally closing the wound of the coup of 1953, and this is something which Zarif and the Iranians under Rouhani have finally achieved. I'll go into a minute why this entire narrative is quite wrong. But it was a narrative that the Americans picked up with great, great enthusiasm. And they picked it up with great, great enthusiasm because it served a particular interest and it served the way they were looking at it. What I want to say about this argument about the nuclear negotiation is, as an example of one of the very simple things that I was trying to argue, that the fault with that fundamentally was this belief that a change in foreign policy, a change in Iran's international relations, would have an automatic and positive impact on its domestic politics. And they assumed that without any assessment of what the domestic politics was going on, what was going on in domestic politics. They simply assumed it. And in many ways, they were fed this narrative by the very people like Zarif and Rouhani themselves, by the way. But they chose to believe it without really double-checking and working it out. So if you think that you're President Rouhani and you're running around, you're having a very tough time in Iran because it's very difficult to get anything done, you say, actually, the solution to this is if we can sort out this problem, this tension abroad, we'll settle it, it's the key, it will unlock all the problems, and we can sort out all our domestic problems. Because actually, it's this tension with America that's causing that. And that's an argument, by the way. I don't want to dismiss it, but I think what was wrong about this was to basically essentialize it into this single point. Because what it basically meant is that Rouhani, during his tenure in office, did very little domestically. He couldn't do, and he didn't even try. On the basis that I'll wait and see what happens internationally, and when we get our nuclear agreement through, everything will be hunky-dory, everyone will thank me for being so brilliant, and the hardliners in Iran will just bend over backwards and sort of allow me to get on with things. That was a flaw in his own thinking, and it was a flaw, I think, in the thinking that was coming abroad. One of the things that I found quite interesting, actually, in terms of these narratives and the echo chambers that were being developed, of course, is that Iran does not have a very strong, interestingly enough, a strong tradition in historical studies, but it has a great interest in international relations. I wrote an article about 10 years ago where I was looking at, actually even longer than that, where I was looking at the way in which the Iranians approached George W. Bush's war in Iraq in 2003. And they approached it in very, very vulgar, realist terms, to quote an IR phrase. They couldn't understand this notion that George W. Bush might have actually a belief, whether it was right or wrong, a belief that what he's doing is exporting democracy. They couldn't get their heads around that. It was all about oil. Okay? And this reflected, to my mind, the fact that what you had is a whole cadre of people in Iran, again, who were all IR people, who didn't really understand. They've never understood the United States, by the way. They never understood the United States. They always look at the United States as the presidency. They don't look at Congress at all. They've never understood it. But that's because, in Iran, there's nobody who actually studies this sort of stuff. Rarely, you get some. I mean, Iran is in some ways better than many of the Arab states, but actually you don't have great centres of, Western studies or US, America studies or whatever to look at the way in which these things operate. So they see everything in terms of the presidency, and they always wonder why the presidency can't just simply get things done. Our supreme leader does it, why doesn't yours? It's not, the idea that Congress might put a block on certain things doesn't quite work. So the whole narrative here was based on a paradigm, of which I was part of, to be honest, or I sort of helped along back in the 1990s, known as the third wave of democratization after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it was this belief that here we are, Francis Fukuyama-like, although I don't want to be rude to him because I think his book's a lot more interesting than his detractors say it is. This sort of notion that liberal democracy is it. We're now basically studying the transition to that democratic strategy, and that's what we need to do. And I will say this about the third wave: it was a good deal more interesting than what came afterwards. But nonetheless, this was part of it. It was a sort of a hangover from the third wave in the 1990s. What we're now going to do is we're now going to find a way that trigger will open up Iran to democracy, and there was a strong belief in that. Now, officially, many diplomats and others would not countenance that. Many of them were much more cynical about it. But if you looked at the rhetoric coming out of ministers and others, and Kerry and so on and so forth, they'll suggest, yes, it's like Nixon going to China. Now we're going to lay the seeds. It's going to open up. Iran will open up, and they'd always get. And they say, yes, there's a very, very young population because young people are progressive and modern, and they'll all want democracy. Not all of them. So the youth bulge was meant. I always used to laugh about the youth bulge because in the 20 years that I've been looking at Iran, this youth bulge seemed to sort of stay static. Everyone was 25 to 30 for a very long time, and nobody seemed to get older, but nevertheless. And then the other thing that you do is you'll find they'll say, but the middle class, where is the middle class? And everyone goes around searching for the middle class in Iran as if it's some sort of like unicorn that they need to find. And the minute we can find this middle class, if you can promote the middle class, democracy will come. If the middle class is demolished, democracy will fall. I mean, as I'll talk to you next week, I think the whole notion of defining Iranian society in terms of lower, working, middle, upper class, whatever, is a flawed assumption anyway, because they don't necessarily work like that. Any more than Iranian, medieval Iran was feudal. Actually, any more than European society was feudal. But you know what I mean? I mean, it's this idea of these ideas that are applied, and then we become prisoners of them. So it was based basically on this notion, in a very simple sense, because policymakers don't like things that are complicated. Moderates and hardliners. We have to support the moderates, undermine the hardliners. If we support this nuclear agreement, we'll support the moderates and we will demolish the hardliners. We have to support this because the consequences of this will be something good. They couldn't sell this JCPOA as it should have been sold, I have to say, as an arms agreement, which is really what it was. Instead, they had to sell it as something that was going to promote the third wave, as something that was going to promote democracy. But they did so without thinking about what was going on internally. They did so without any understanding of the domestic politics, or indeed any understanding of the domestic history. So let's take Zarif being Mossadegh for a start. One of the things that the Iranians did exceptionally well, I have to say, and Zarif was particularly good at this, and you got this all through American politics, was that you Americans, you owe us. You owe us because you overthrew our Prime Minister in 1953. And you owe us a debt. And interestingly enough, there were lots of Americans actually bought this nonsense, I have to say. I mean, I said, why history is one thing. Let's study that history. But you can't develop policy on guilt. More to the point, because nobody in Iran really in the regime actually gives two hoots about Mossadegh. I mean, the diaspora is obsessed about Mossadegh. There are many young people obsessed about Mossadegh. But to be perfectly honest with you, the first time there was a street, I'm not even saying a road. No, what's smaller, a road or a street? Anyway, it's a kuche, where one of these lanes in Iran, was named after Mossadegh, was I think 5 years ago. Yeah? The main thoroughfare in Tehran was originally named Mossadegh Street, and Khomeini said, get rid of that, matey, we're not having that. We're having a proper Muslim name for that. And there was a lot of criticism of in the orthodox narrative, when I say the revolutionary narrative in Iran was quite different to the narrative that was being sold to an American public, and which an American public, in some sense, absorbed almost willingly, as if it was Kool-Aid. I don't know if any of you have seen, but there's a wonderful graphic novel on Operation Ajax, which you should have a look at. And if you've seen Argo, by the way, just look at the first 2-3 minutes. That cartoon exhibition at the beginning is complete nonsense. But there you are. This is popular history, and this is what happens. So basically, the central narrative that Zarif was putting out is you owe us because you overthrew our democratically elected prime minister, and because you overthrew our democratically elected prime minister, we were subject to dictatorship for 25 years, and this is why we're here. So you owe us. It's a lovely, simple narrative. It's not true, but it's a lovely, simple narrative. How does the regime see the whole Mossadegh narrative, as in Khamenei and others? They saw it slightly differently, and it was blatantly obvious if you've ever watched or read or anything that they did domestically. They said that Mossadegh was an interesting guy, but he trusted the Americans. And because he trusted the Americans, he fell. If they want to pump themselves up and pretend to be the second Mossadegh, good luck with that. Because, and lo and behold, you're going to be betrayed by the Americans. But the idea being that Mossadegh was irrelevant. When they were saying to Zarif, you are the second Mossadegh, they weren't saying you're a hero of the hour. They were saying you're a gullible fool. So those two different interpretations were important. If people had done the work and looked at what the domestic narrative was in terms of the political elite in Iran, they would have understood that that wasn't really working. More to the point, as I said, because in Iran, Mossadegh is not celebrated. Well, I'm talking about the regime here, by the way. The regime does not celebrate. And incidentally, I would say to you here that in Iran today, there's a much more nuanced discussion about Mossadegh than there is outside the country. Yeah, they have much, much more different and interesting mythologies in a sense about a more historical analysis, but the fact is that was used very effectively. There's two other things that I'll just say. I've got a little bit of time, because I don't want to go over the time limit, but I've got you here now, so you have to stay. It's bank holiday, what the hell are you going to do? The two things I just want to also emphasize. The nuclear fatwa was very simple to do. There was a great fascination with the nuclear fatwa in America. They said, we've got to get this deal through. It's very clear. Khamenei has issued a nuclear fatwa that means that he can never have weapons of mass destruction. So I said, and I did say this, I said, so does that mean the fatwa against Rushdie is still extant then? Don't interrupt me with these pointless comments. I said, hang on a minute. In 1998, the British government came to an agreement with the then Iranian government that the Iranian government would not pursue the fatwa against Rushdie and pursue him to death. We thought that was a great triumph in 1998, and I think it was. What you're saying now, of course, is that in this case, the nuclear fatwa is irrevocable and it's set in stone. So which one is it? Nobody wanted to deal with it. Lo and behold, today, funnily enough, as a lot of us were saying, if Khamenei decides to wake up one morning and say, I'd like to issue a new fatwa, please, on nuclear weapons because I've changed my mind, he can do it. Nothing is in stone. And yet, believe it or not, in the whole negotiations, the nuclear fatwa was a central pillar of why it was sold. And academics, I have to tell you, who should have known better, came out in support of this and said, no, in Shiism, a fatwa is sacrosanct. Is it? It isn't. Anyone who's a Shia scholar will tell you that is not the case. Fatwas can change. The reason why the fatwa against Rushdie hasn't changed is A, Khamenei died, but more importantly, nobody has the guts to basically overturn his fatwa, because the fatwa of a living mujtahid always overrules the fatwa of a living mujtahid, but they won't do it because it's him. But in any other case, and this is the whole basis of Shiism, of course, is that fatwas are continually revised and reissued. Otherwise, there's no progress. And that's one thing. Heroic flexibility was another one that came up, which again was very interesting, and again, this is the sort of issue of Kremlinology that affects us all when we deal with Iran. Khamenei gave a speech saying maybe now is the time, like one of the Shia imams, to show a bit of heroic flexibility. This was immediately interpreted by a number of people that, he's about to compromise and basically settle his relations with the United States. Actually, what he said in heroic flexibility, wait for it, if you read the text, is sometimes it is good to make a tactical concession in order to get to your strategic goal. You can decide on your own what that means. Okay, so that's the element of the policy of JCPOA, and one of the key elements of it, of course, was the establishment of essentially an echo chamber. Ben Rhodes, who was Obama's chief advisor on the Middle East, as it happens, which is slightly odd, basically revealed in an article that he had a good coterie of journalists and other analysts who were fed certain sort of lines that were then repeated back to each other, and we basically established something that a sort of an echo chamber of views. It's very difficult to penetrate, but what you do get is that, as I said, that sort of semiological chain. People repeated them so often that they became fact. And the nuclear fatwa was one of them. It's very difficult to actually penetrate that, even though people were, we were arguing that that this was not the case. Now, the last one I really want to look at is these paradigms, and this is where we get into, and I won't take too long with this, but what I want to basically say to you is there are two paradigms here about the nature of the state, and I favour this one rather than this one, and I'll explain why in the next couple of weeks, but I'll show you that what I'm really looking at and what I'm interested in is why one has gained traction and the other hasn't, by the way, but I'll hopefully try and explain that to you in a minute. So this is the one that, among others, that basically has been at the centre of the debate on authoritarian resilience. And this is the one written, actually, James Robinson is actually British, but he works in Chicago, on what are the aspects of state organisation, political and economic organisation that lead to state failure. I mean, he says why nations fail, but I don't think nation is the right term in this context, but it's really about state failure. His is a much more qualitative analysis. This is a much more quantitative analysis. And as I was saying to you last week, there is a tendency for people to love the quantitative element over the qualitative, because the qualitative is something where you're trying to get to the essence, whereas the quantitative is something which seems to have a sort of exactness. And what Levitsky and Way have done is they've tried to apply what can best be described as a scientific method in terms of the natural sciences, so there's lots of phrases and words in the book that relate to physics and other things, to political change. So the first thing I'll say about authoritarian resilience is this, is that I'm unaware that we need a theory to prove authoritarian resilience, because any historian will tell you that most political systems in history have been one form or another been autocratic. So why you need a theory to prove this is for me a little bit unclear. But what elements of authoritarian resilience do I actually agree with, and I think is quite useful and contributes to the debate? And it's basically this idea that popular authoritarians, authoritarian populism if you will, does provide a degree of fungibility, and a fungibility that allows the state to survive and absorb shocks. Okay? And what might this be? It could be allowing an occasional election. Okay? Even an inadequate one, but at least it does the trick. It could be the spreading of largesse, let's put a bit of money around. Yeah? It could be networks of welfare, that keep people together. Those are things that, when things get tough and things are not going too well, you can maybe release the valve a bit and allow a bit of... And that actually is a central element of authoritarian resilience, as I would understand it, which in my own book on Iran, Islam and Democracy was very central to that model, and the model that I'll show you next week. So that part of it I get, and I think it's very sensible. Yeah, clearly, astute management of your politics means that you can release tensions now and then, you can spread a bit of bread and circuses, it helps. The problem is really when you move away from this to something more mechanistic or a quote scientific reading. So where I have problems with this thesis is, first of all, it's a paradigm. Okay, it's a paradigm, and American IR loves paradigms, and they build paradigms and they promote it and they reinforce it. The third wave was a paradigm. We all got hooked up about civil society, the development of civil society and the development of democracy. Everyone followed that paradigm, and for many years, that's the only funding you could get. Okay? What authoritarian resilience is flipping that on its head and saying the third wave hasn't happened. Authoritarian systems are surviving, therefore we're going to have a new paradigm. As a discussion, yes, but as a general theory, it doesn't work. Why? First of all, if you paint it too broadly and too comparatively, you're drawing comparisons with states that simply don't bear comparison. In order to make your theory work, if you want a general theory, you're having to exclude things that don't fit that theory. So Levitsky, for instance, doesn't include fascism. He doesn't include the Nazis. The French Revolution doesn't even get mentioned. Okay? So, I mean, it does get mentioned, but it's not one of his examples. So all sorts of elements there are sort of, there's a fairly tight definition of what he calls a social revolution, not political revolution, but social revolution. It's also basically assumes that the states that come in through this social revolution are basically founded essentially from scratch. They come into a vacuum and they build up from nothing, and they sort of build up from nothing through repeated pressures and reactions. He's got this wonderful phrase called reactive sequencing, which is always in italics to give it an extra sort of gravitas. But reactive sequencing is simply the fact that, as it said somewhere in the book, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, which is a sort of Newtonian physics, which I don't think really applies, but nonetheless, it's sort of this notion that, revolutions often face a counter-revolution, they overcome the counter-revolution, then they have, to paraphrase Nietzsche, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Okay? Again, for me, it doesn't work. Because what doesn't kill you can also make you weaker, by the way, if you're not able to basically reinforce or restore yourself. But this sort of notion that there's a sort of a general theory that can apply to these states which explains authoritarian resilience is a highly mechanistic reading of a real-world situation which doesn't really work. It's too thin, it's not deep enough, it doesn't really go into the background. And if you look at the chapters on Iran, for instance, there's all sorts of interesting comments in there which I don't think stand up to the test of any historian. He also says, by the way, and this is the interesting thing, when you have resilience, you're not talking about durability. I mean, one of the examples he does have, of course, is the Soviet Union, and of course we know the Soviet system fell. So when you're what I find interesting about this is that I'm very much happy to talk about resilience, but what I really want to know is for how long. There's no point telling me that something's resilient. I want to know whether it's on the verge of collapse or not, or whatever. Yeah? And if one of your examples is the Soviet Union, well, we all know that didn't end well. He also says, in actual fact, in 2009, which I wouldn't have said, the regime in Iran almost collapsed. So if the regime almost collapsed in 2009, it can't be that resilient. I mean, there are a lot of anomalies there, and I think that needs to be sort of borne in mind. But these are the sort of, I think, mechanistic readings. It's a sort of a mechanistic reading which doesn't take into account the historical realities of the case study you're looking at. What it does is try to apply a general theory, and the more general the theory, the less relevant I think it is to us. But be that as it may, I think it has a number of interesting points that it can tell us. I think it can contribute to the debate, and I think it can highlight, it sort of bring out other questions that we need to ask, certainly about the notion of resilience. So to come back into preview really for next week, why did the Shah fall? Is this a seminar you've just been to? No, not a seminar. No. If you were to apply the doctrine of authoritarian resilience to the Shah, he shouldn't have fallen. Why did the Shah fall? For me, the reasons the Shah fell were not simply the question of whether there was an opposition or not an opposition. It's really to do with the nature of the state in which he ran, the centrality of the Shah to that state, and the failure of the Shah, in a sense, to take the decisions that were necessary at the time, or the correct decisions, either in the medium term or in the short term, to actually alleviate or to push back the revolution. Did people predict the revolution? No, they didn't. And one way of looking at that, of course, is to say, well, we all got it wrong because we didn't look at the right things. The other way to look at it, of course, is that actually in many ways the factors we were looking at indicated that the system was actually stronger than we imagined, but the one thing that we got wrong was the psychology of the Shah himself. The keystone of the whole system failed. And when the keystone of the whole system failed, and people say that, they say, we weren't sure whether the Shah had changed from the individual he was in 1953 when he packed his bags and went abroad. I mean, that's just an argument I'm saying, because what I want to, if you look at it, Abrahamian has a wonderful article that came out in 1978, which he preferred to forget, of course. But it's a great article called The Non-Revolutionary Peasant in Modern Iran. I did remind him of it, actually, when I said, oh, interesting, because it shows that nobody really had a clue. And this article is a great article, actually. He's really complaining about the non-revolutionary peasant in modern Iran. Why the hell don't they get up and do something? Because they've been bought. Authoritarian resilience, right? Fred Halliday had a wonderful book called Dictatorship and Development. But there were 3 editions, of which I have all 3. And the first edition will tell you that the Shah has another 10 years in him. Should we criticise him for it? No, I wouldn't. I think Fred Halliday was actually, as far as someone who was a professor of international relations, a very fine professor of international relations. It's a natural thing. You can't horizon scan, in that sense, and not make mistakes, of course, because we can't see over the horizon. But it's just a salutary lesson to those of us who are now sitting around saying, with the definitive sense that this will survive, this will be resilient, this will do that. That's not how it works. And we have the experience ourselves of the constitutional revolution in Iran in 1906, of the Islamic revolution in Iran in 1978-79, to show actually that people didn't necessarily see how things were going to unfold. Not because they didn't necessarily have an idea on the various factors that would be influential. Everyone knew that the Qajar monarchy was deeply unpopular in 1906. People knew that the Shah was not exactly Mr. Charisma in 1978 and was making a lot of mistakes. But political change is contingent on various things happening that we can't always predict. And all we can do as historians, to go back to the phrase I was using last time, in terms of prophesy over predict, we can't predict these things. But what we can do is a better job of really assessing what the trajectories are, and how volatile and how varied they can be. And shouldn't have, and this is the other point I was saying last week, the humility to recognise that. And if I have one really biting, bitter, angry comment about some of my colleagues in those awful disciplines, is the level of certainty with which they face the future. I wouldn't be so certain. History, if anything, has taught me not to be. What I will do next week, however, because it's very easy to moan about others, is to start building, in a sense, the template for my own understanding of why I think, at the end of the day, what we're seeing in Iran today is a dysfunctional state, and a dysfunctional state which, to borrow from Acemoglu and Robinson, is actually in a depreciating cycle. And a depreciating cycle, not simply, as they argue, and I've discussed this with him, not simply as they argue on an economic basis, because his argument is that poor governance, it's a very basic model actually, it's the sort of model that you would have, people in studying political economy in the 19th century would have told you, if you get your governance wrong, you will start to depreciate the value, in a sense, of your state. You will extract more than you put in. But their argument, in a sense, and I said, is basically focused very much on that economic deterioration, that poor management, poor governance, the kleptocracy, whatever it is, extracts more and more out of the state. I think that's absolutely right, but I want to add to that 2 other less quantifiable elements, which is why it's not as popular. As I said to you, the notion of political capital and moral capital. That for a state to be successful, and this applies across the board, by the way, it applies to this bloody country as well, excuse my French, but in any other country, if you do not reinvest in your political, economic and moral infrastructure, at the end of the day you will find them brittle and subject to collapse.